This is the Stu Hart Heritage Heavyweight Champion, the masterpiece, Chris Adonis, telling you to tune into HN Live March the 29th for Unfinished Business 2.
Now, switching gears entirely. It was just under a year ago at HN Live, we got the opportunity to broadcast a show that was very special to us. And for us, there's a little bit of unfinished business. So here's the announcement we've all been waiting for. Coming up in just a few weeks, Friday, March 29th, Dungeon Wrestling Unfinished Business 2, live from the Victoria Pavilion in Calgary, will be live on HNLive.ca, and we're so pleased to be joined by the voice, the play-by-play broadcaster for Dungeon Wrestling, Mike McGuire, also the host of the McGuire on Wrestling podcast and mornings on 98.1 The Ranch in Lethbridge. Mike, we're so pleased to have you on the show and so pleased to partner up with Dungeon Wrestling.
I'm ecstatic to be here. Thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about our show and what we're going to be bringing to HN Live and what you're going to help us bring to the world here. This won't be our first foray with HN Live, but the company has definitely grown quite a bit since our last time together. So excited to know what you guys want to know about the show and talk all about it.
Mike, Sean and I have been wrestling consumers, much like yourself, since we were, children. And I think anybody who grew up watching wrestling has always has a piece of that in their heart. So as we've seen wrestling evolve over the years, what exactly can people expect? For those who haven't seen Dungeon Wrestling before, what can they expect from the brand?
It's pretty amazing because for those that have never seen Dungeon Wrestling before, I always say, have you seen Stampede Wrestling? And some people have seen clips here and there, like little pieces of Stampede throughout the decades. And we've all seen highlight reels through Hall of Fame nominations for guys like Bret Hart and others who came through the Calgary territory back in the day. But what you honestly get with Dungeon Wrestling is just hard-hitting, common sense, yay, boo, good guys, bad guys, pro wrestling at its finest. You get some of the best athletes from not just across Canada, not just across Alberta, but literally around the world come together to be a part of this thing. We've already had some of the biggest names out there. Our last champion before our current one just happens to be the general manager of WWE SmackDown now in Nick Aldis, the national treasure. There's other names that are vying for that championship too. Once Chris Masters, who's our current champion, won the title, he's been taking that thing around the world with him, defending it in different places. So the credibility of that title is getting up there, but now it's getting the attention of some people who know the legacy of Calgary Pro Wrestling, who know the legacy of heart-built pro wrestling, and you're getting wrestlers that really, really, really want to perform, and people like to throw the word compete around. I think it's compete for the attention and the top spot of wrestling fans.
Well, I want to talk about that legacy, but you brought up Chris Masters, and here's a guy who's not only had the national recognition of being a star in the World Wrestling Entertainment, but at the same time, if you haven't seen him as a wrestling fan in the last 5 years, the evolution of his game. I mean, as he's gotten more experience in the game and he's gone around the world, this is a finely tuned pro wrestler who has taken his ability up to the next level, now one of the best in the world. I think he's leaps and bounds, even above where he was in WWE.
Oh, and he'll tell you the same thing without trying to be, conceited about it. I had the chance to talk with him as he was on his way in the first time, and he was getting contention for that championship. We had him on the podcast, and I just said, exactly what you're saying, Sean. The Chris Masters that you may have seen on TV, who is just a body guy, who just, he's big, has totally changed. His style has become very technical. He's become very ground-based, very finessed as well. There's some extra agility. He has leaned down physically. So as you guys know with hockey players or any other athletes, if you lean down, you trim down, you get into a better cardiovascular condition. That allows you to do all sorts of different things. He can go longer. He somehow, even though not being as big maybe as he was when he was a kid, seems stronger and is able to last longer. So yeah, his performance really lends itself to what Dungeon Wrestling is all about, which again, I mean, we've got Bret Hart behind the scenes running the books, and he's trying to make sure the matches all make sense. And when Bret Hart gives you the nod and says, yeah, you know, you're our guy, I mean, obviously Masters had to get in that spot, but to be there and say, okay, you know what, we're okay with this, then, I mean, that tells you what kind of a wrestler he's become.
Well, and talk about the matchup there with Steve Macklin, because these, again, when you look at pro wrestling these days, there's some people that think, okay, there's, you know, WWE and there's whatever other big companies out there. It's probably the greatest state of independent wrestling there's been in generations. There's so much talent out there that isn't locked into one of those major national companies. And you have two of the best of them set to compete for the Stu Hart Championship on Friday, March 29th on HNLive.
And that's the amazing thing about it, you know. I mean, Masters was a part of the NWA for a while there. Steve Macklin, a part of TNA Wrestling, and both great places to work if you want to be a wrestler and own your craft and get noticed around the world. It's a great way to do it. But when you're in those positions and you're wanting to come to Dungeon Wrestling, and I could laundry list a bunch of names who have said, we want to be there, who are in that category. Like you said, independent wrestling now has a litany of varieties for wrestlers to go and compete in different areas and territories or regions or whatever you want to call it. But there's something about Dungeon Wrestling. There's something about being in that Victoria Pavilion. You walk in, I don't care how old you are, when the first time you saw wrestling was, if it's the first time you're seeing it now, it transforms you. It takes you back to that time where you're just there for the excitement. You're there for the action. And that's not just the fans, that's the wrestlers themselves. So like you said, these upper echelon independent wrestling stars are really want to be a part of what we're doing in Dungeon Wrestling. And, you know, without trying to be the guy that hypes the pay-per-view here, I mean, you never know what's going to happen or who might show up or who might make themselves known coming up on March 29th.
Mike, now, anybody watching this who doesn't consume wrestling lately, right? They might be more into UFC or they might be more into different sports here or there. You mentioned earlier that it has a lot of that yay, boo, the traditional style of wrestling. Yeah. And myself, who was a very WWE, WCW back in the day, right? When the two of them were rivals. And that was when wrestling, I think, was probably at its pinnacle in the world. What makes Dungeon Wrestling so special for the viewer who doesn't consume wrestling today? You know, and I will advocate for. I watched your guys' initial pay-per-view last year, and I haven't watched wrestling in 10 years. I was blown away.
You know, there is something about simplicity, and it's not just in wrestling that I could say this. I mean, we could talk about this with hockey. We could talk about this with baseball, football. Sometimes the classic stuff still works. You know, you can have all the trick shots, you can have all the amazing moves and everything else, but sometimes just knowing what you're doing and doing it well enough to get the job done is all it takes. And that's kind of what the Calgary scene was always about. It wasn't about always being the flashiest. It was about going in there and convincing the fans that I'm going to fight for your side or I don't like you, and getting the crowd involved in it. The other thing I got to say too about pro wrestling and MMA and everything else is that we all know that what we're watching is meant to be consumed by a mass audience. That's what pro wrestling always has been. That's why it's been on TV longer than any other medium. That's why it's been a backbone for digital pay-per-view and things like this. It's because it has such a broad appeal. So if you come to a wrestling match and just keep it simple for yourself coming in, you'd be amazed how many people who say, oh, I've never seen wrestling. That's whatever. That stuff's silly. They leave the shows and they're just blown away by the experiences they've had. I see it every show. I'll walk around because I do some of the ring announcing for the shows as well, and I'll talk to the fans beforehand, and you can spot the ones that have never been to a wrestling show before, and they're kind of laughing, like, yeah, look at this sort of thing. By the end of it, they're the ones leading the chants. They're the ones, you know, throwing babies in the air and you know, spilling their beer all over the place and everything else because they get that excited about it.
Yeah.
Now, Mike, you grew up, obviously, we all grew up when watching wrestling romanticizing the concept of being a ring announcer, right? Like we always, would do the Jim Ross and, whether we're slamming our dolls or stuffed animals down. I had that Ted DiBiase $1 million man doll that I would elbow drop. And you have the opportunity now to be the play-by-play guy, right? So, and you're good at it. What's that been like for you to step into as a niche, and how much are you enjoying that? And incorporating all those concepts, not only being a broadcaster, but also being that kid growing up, enjoying it. Now you get to be that guy.
Well, first of all, Dave, I'll forgive you for using the D word. It's action figure. But nevertheless.
I realized as soon as I said doll, I'm like, oh, I'm going to get raked over the coals for that one.
No, it's fine. I mean, hey, tell Ted DiBiase that he had a doll,
I did actually when I interviewed him years ago. So
well, there you go. But when it comes down to it, honestly, when I was a kid growing up, I didn't want to be an announcer. I wanted to be Bret Hart's tag team partner. I wanted to win the tag team championships and go around the world. I did train. I did wrestle. I had an injury outside of wrestling that actually stopped me from being able to do that. And radio was always the other dream job. Being a broadcaster was. And I noticed as I would grow up watching those guys, like you mentioned, watching Jim Ross's, watching Tony Schiavone, going back and finding out about the guys like Gordon Soley, and even me and Gene Okerlund, who, the rare times that you would catch him doing commentary as opposed to just the backstage interviews, had his own style. And then you get into the guys of today, like guys like Michael Cole, Corey Graves. You flip over to AEW. Jim Ross is there now. It's crazy. Like the art of calling a match, the art of being involved, having the excitement there, but at the same time, trying to make sure you're making the wrestlers the focus. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not there to get Mike McGuire a profile and get him over to be like, hey, look how great I'm talking about these wrestlers. What it's all about, honestly, is getting involved in the match. And I think the only way you can do that is by remaining a fan. I don't think you can do this and not be a fan of wrestling. And that's something that for the longest time, as my broadcasting career would go, sometimes bosses be like, the wrestling stuff, do you really got to talk about that so much? And it wasn't until just a few years ago when I started this thing with Dungeon Wrestling, I realized I've been living a lie my whole life. And that's that I'm not a radio guy. I'm not a radio guy that likes wrestling. I'm a wrestling guy that just happens to have been doing radio for a long time. And so for me, it was the next best thing. If I can't get you over in the ring, if I can't wrestle and do that sort of thing that way, I'm going to give you my darndest to give you a show on the mic, and at the same time, make it you that they're keeping their eyes on. So,
well, you told us very briefly when we were talking before we started recording about when Bret Hart asked you to be the voice of Dungeon Wrestling and work with you guys. I mean, for a guy who grew up being a wrestling fan in Canada, there is nobody that compares to him. All of us, even when it wasn't that it was scripted. I remember being a teenager going to a show, and that's the person that you still latched onto emotionally. So for that individual, to become your friend and your business partner, but to ask you to be the voice of the legacy of the Hart family, what was that moment like for you?
Geez, when you say it like that, I don't know. It just kind of made me realize what happened.
I'm getting goosebumps remembering having all my Bret Hart stuff, and I'm just like, if Bret Hart called me, like that would be mind blowing.
I'm just saying, I might have a doll of the boss right here, but it's amazing though, because it's funny, when this whole Dungeon Wrestling thing started, I was doing a national radio show, which the podcast is based on. That radio entity doesn't exist anymore. So that's how McGuire on Wrestling became what it is. But
and over 86 episodes, 30,000 plus downloads at least. So you're doing well on that show.
We're doing all right. Oh, there's the WCW. Actually, that one has a weird switch on the back too. If you flip it around, I think it makes his arms go up and down or something.
Yeah, something like that. I actually have a whole bag of them in my room. I was just cleaning out storage the other day, and I was like, "Oh, there's my Bret Hart stuff." So
I'll answer the Bret question in a second, but I do have to say this: I did once send him a picture of my Bret collection, and I was like, "We're still cool, right?" And it's like he was okay with it, so it's fine. But
where's your El Dandy action figure? That's the question.
What's that?
Where's your El Dandy action figure?
Hey, El Dandy's a hell of a wrestler. He's
who are you to tell El Dandy?
He's a bang up guy. He's a serious professional. But when it comes down to that moment, like you said about Brett giving me the nod sort of thing, it all happened by accident. I was doing the show driving across Canada. I had some personal stuff going on. And so I was driving across Canada in the US, and I was still covering shows. And I was literally doing the show on the road out of the back of a camper. So I turned this camper into a studio, a 3-mic studio with all lighting and everything else going on. It was great. So Brett and I were buddies, and I was like, hey, I'm going to show up at this show. Is that cool? He's like, yeah, I talked to Dal. So I talked to Dal, and Dal's like, yeah, great. So here I am showing up at this outdoor show in Calgary with a camper and saying, let's do my radio show in this thing. And Brett and I, again, like you said, we'd worked before a few times, but even as I had Dallas and him sitting there talking about Dungeon Wrestling and what it was going to be, that was when the conversation kind of started, because they were trying to figure out, okay, we want to do this on some sort of broadcast medium. We want to stream this somehow. We're not sure how we want to do it yet, but we need a voice for it. And the microphones may have still been rolling when this entire conversation happened, and I might still have that audio, which, I don't know, maybe in my will I'll make sure that it's played somewhere, because but it's something I keep right here, you know what I mean, because it's so special. But he said flat out, like, we want to take this thing places, we want to go big places, and we're going to need a voice for that. And he looks at Dal, and he looks at me, and he goes, I think you could be the voice for it. And honestly, guys, wrestling announcing, wrestling commentary, wrestling play-by-play, I'd always been a ring announcer, and I take the ring announcing job very seriously too, which is something that I believe is an art in its own, if done right and done well. But then to be trusted as the guy to do the entire show was like, holy. So we did it. I did the first one solo, and then we brought a couple guys in who are hilarious, because they're just a couple of business guys, but they're also friends of the family, and they're really diehard wrestling fans. And so now we're a 3-man team, which I love, because they're growing in this role. I kind of get to coach them as to, get in, get out, don't go too inside on it. Like, nothing worse than we were watching a hockey game sometimes, right? And you can have the little banter between the commentators, but ultimately you want them to tell you about the game. You don't want them going into a 5-minute conversation on their own, right? So not that our guys have ever done that, but now we're getting this flow, and you're getting this team that's worked together for a bunch of shows. So myself, Mitch Honsius, Dimitri Karolis, they're fantastic, and we have an absolute blast every time we do one of these shows. It is awe-inspiring, and we'll put our headsets down afterwards and just look at each other and be like, huh, that just happened, and that was just us doing it. So, I mean, to take you from the moment of Eep, where Brett's like, yeah, you should be the guy, to now we're feeling good about it. Now we're really proud of what's going on, and I get to help out with production stuff or offer. There might have been a time where I suggested something to one of the wrestlers, and Brett looked at me and said, I agree with Mike. And I was like, so, you have those moments where you're still going to be a little fanboy, right? But overall, it really is exciting. And it's something I don't take for granted either. It's what if I can't be in there wrestling, it's the next thing I'd want to be doing is this. So
just to wrap up with you then, A, I'm going to put you on the spot. Mm-hmm. What's your favorite all-time Bret Hart match? B, what would you tell, just to close things out, somebody who's never watched Dungeon Wrestling before, why, if they're not in the Calgary area, they can't make it to the show, which is the best way to experience it, of course, if you can get there live and be there at the Victoria Pavilion on March 29th. But if they can't, what's your sales pitch for buying the pay-per-view on HNLive.ca?
Well, I'll tell you this right now. First of all, for people that have seen some of our matches on YouTube that go up every once in a while, like I help produce that as well. So I see the comments. I see the feedback from around the world. People are wanting to make the trip to Calgary from places like the UK, Australia. They're like, this is wrestling history. This is a wrestling mecca that you see these shows in. To answer your first question, which really isn't a put me on the spot match, my favorite match is Brett versus Owen, SummerSlam 94. An amazing steel cage match. Not a drop of blood flowed, but it was still one of the most brutal matches you'll ever see in your life. And it was the first time you saw the sharpshooter reversed ever. So that was kind of cool. But going back to our shows and why you should invest the time and invest a little bit of cash. And really, as far as deals go, guys, for live broadcast wrestling, I mean, it's a steal to get it on HN Live to begin with. if you can't make the show, watch this thing live, because not only are you seeing some of that ground and pound, gritty heart style Calgary wrestling that we've talked about. I mean, this is the stuff that Japan is still based on a lot today, that some of the best wrestlers in the world today. I mean, you've got guys in AEW, WWE, everywhere that still use this style of wrestling because it became so popular. But you're also getting the chance to support something. You're getting in on the grassroots of something. If there's one thing I've known about wrestling fans is that they always want to be a part of it. You want to feel like you belong. That's why you fly the company flag. That's why you fly your favorite wrestler's name or t-shirt or whatever, is that you want to be a part of something special. This is as legit as you can get when it comes to having a great time, watching some cool wrestling, and again, helping build something really special. This is, like you said, it's the next generation. It's the legacy of Hart Family Pro Wrestling. I'm not saying this for my sake. I'm not even saying it for the wrestler's sake. I'm saying this for the fans' sake. We're just over really a year into this thing now. And to see the way things have grown and the interest and everything, it's because we're all working together as a team. Everybody believes in this thing behind the scenes. The family's behind it 100%. The fans are behind it 100%. And if you give it a chance, if you watch the show live, if you're able to join us, but if you can't, watch it here on HNLive. And I'll tell you right now, it's going to be one of the best things you watch, hands down.
HNLive very proud to be the streaming home, the pay-per-view home for Dungeon Wrestling Unfinished Business 2, coming up on March 29th. We are joined by the Stu Hart champion, who's set to defend his crown against Steve Macklin on March 29th, Unfinished Business 2 for Dungeon Wrestling on HNLive.ca. There it is. Chris Masters, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
And just in case you are wondering, yes, I am in my car and traveling with the Dungeon Championship in the passenger seat with the seatbelt on, by the way. So, yeah, I mean, I take it everywhere. The grocery store, the gym, the park, it goes everywhere. I mean, it's prestigious. It's the Stu Hart Championship. And then even better, even funnier yet, I have actually the WWC title in the back seat. So I should have said that out loud. They might get hot. Sometimes the WWC title rides shotgun. You know what I mean? They alternate.
Well, I mean, to be honest, growing up, I think we were all wrestling fans, and if we had a real belt, we'd want to carry it everywhere, right? Into the grocery store, to the gas station. So you get to live that real life situation.
Oh yeah, it's pretty cool, man. It's you know what the funny part about it is I won the Dungeon title, or the Stu Hart title at Dungeon Wrestling, and which has been tremendous being there. By the way, I've had some tremendous matches there, but and then I went to Puerto Rico recently and won that title, and so my whole question in my mind was like how do you walk out with two titles and still do your entrance? It was literally something I kind of had to walk through and figure out if I wanted to wear both of them, you know what I mean? Which I did for all the reasons you just outlined,
You mentioned the prestige of being the Stu Hart champion. I mean,
yeah.
one of the great legends of the sport. What did it mean to you to win a championship that had that name on it?
Oh my gosh. I mean, for me, I think anybody from my generation, well, and beyond, because Bret Hart is timeless, the Hart family, their royalty. But I just grew up in the Hart family, and Bret Hart, Stu Hart, Owen, they were such a big part of my young fandom, my childhood growing up. And, Stu Hart was always put on a pedestal, you know what I mean? He was always honored from the minute I became aware of him. And some of the funniest imitations have been of Stu Hart too. You know what I mean? He's a funny guy to imitate, and I'm not saying I can do it, but just for me, I was such a fan of Bret Hart, and seeing Bret, rise to the top in the way he did, seeing the way he won the Intercontinental title against Mr. Perfect with Stu Hart there and Helen Hart. And these are all huge memories for me, and some of my fondest. And then even the Bret Hart Roddy Piper feud, Stu Hart, even if you didn't grow up with watching Stu Hart the wrestler, as a fan from my childhood, Stu Hart was entangled in everything that related to the Harts, or a lot of the big storylines. And the Dungeon was legendary and a thing of mystique, and still to this day. And and then even when I look at Stampede Wrestling, when I looked back at Stampede Wrestling, man, like there was such innovation coming out of there. Like I think some of my favorite early I wasn't aware of Stampede at the time, being a Los Angeles kid, but it was just like looking back at it, they were such innovators, and like some of the best wrestling came. I think they might have even revolutionized, kind of changing the business a little bit as far as how going from that era, like the Ric Flairs and the call it on the fly style, which nothing wrong with that. I love that. I trained under Rip Rogers, but a little more thought was put into stuff, and creativity. Just like anything else, it was actually really, when you look at it, was just like the evolution of professional wrestling, and nothing's ever going to stay the same. It's always going to change a little bit, but should stay grounded in some fundamental values, if that makes sense. But to go back to the Stu Hart title means everything, man. Anybody who sees that title, man, like I show that title off at every locker room I go to. I defend it at every indie show that I can, and like it carries weight. It's not just, and it's a beautiful title on top of it.
Well, and yeah, you talked about the inspiration that the Hart family was, and for those maybe who are watching who don't know, did you have the opportunity to be mentored actually by Stu Hart in the dungeon, and the Hart family? Was that part of your journey to the professional ranks on your way up?
No, gosh, I wish it was, but no, it wasn't. I mean, I think by the time I was breaking in, I don't think Stu was I don't know how hands-on Stu was with any training at that point, but my training came out of UPW. But as far as like, again, my inspirations, I mean, like Bret Hart was a huge inspiration to me. Like he was one of the first guys. He was actually the first guy that I recognized, like any kid, when I first started watching wrestling, like I was attracted, you were either a Warrior guy or Hogan guy initially. And I was a Warrior guy. The face paint, the music, all the flash, like the body, it really was captivating. But, we know what happened with Warrior. It came and went. And then somewhere in that time frame, I started seeing first Bret Hart and then even HBK, and seeing what they brought. And to me, that was just a whole, like, that's cool what the Warrior did, but like, that was just something different. It was like there was an art to that I appreciated just a little more than, all that over the topness of those characters. It was a little more grounded in reality, a little more based in athleticism and pro wrestling and creativity, and not just, feeding the fans the same thing every given night, month after month, year after year, and decade after decade.
How cool must it have been for you then to have grown up admiring guys like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, to then, as a very young man, to get to the World Wrestling Entertainment and have a feud with Shawn Michaels? What was that experience like for you?
Oh, gosh. It was, I might as well have been winning the world championship for me. It was, if you were to give me a bucket list of my things to do in wrestling, obviously the world title would be on there. Wrestling Shawn Michaels on pay-per-view, though, specifically, because, he, to me, was such a, growing up and watching Shawn, you just knew that, like, he was one of those guys that you knew that when the pay-per-view came, he was going to, like, turn it up. You know what I mean? He was like, and same thing with Bret, too. You know what I mean? But, like, you just knew those guys were going to turn it up, and they were going to give you a pay-per-view level performance. Like, and like, what they would do on regular TV was already so awesome as it is. You know what I mean? Like, but they would even turn it up another notch, as you should for a pay-per-view when people are paying to see you. So, like, yeah, working Shawn on a pay-per-view, and not like screwing the pooch, to quote Bill DeMott, was everything to me. It was, but I have to say, in the moment, it was stressful because I was so worried about that. Like, because in my mind, I didn't want to be the first guy in history to have a bad match with Shawn Michaels on pay-per-view. Not to think that I thought that was going to happen, but like, even the chance of that would have devastated me. So it put a lot of pressure on me. But like, when I look back at it now, man, it's a lot of fun. And I, like, more recently, I recognized that the timing of it was probably the coolest too, because it came right out of that Hulk Hogan feud. So you just came off the only little bit of heel Shawn Michaels you were going to get. But also, if you watch Shawn, when he transitions to the feud with me, he has such a different energy. And I think, like, for me, it was the perfect time to work him, because he just went from working Hulk, who was, we've heard about how that all went. You know what I mean? It was Rocky and with those guys and stuff, and two big egos, to working this kid who's just like ready to bump for him and do whatever. And like, it was basically a mark for him. And like when I look back at it now, I can see that like, and I didn't even notice at the time, like that he was really appreciating that in that moment. You know what I mean? And I didn't think that, because like I was just thinking like, he probably doesn't care that much about working me. I mean, how many pay-per-view matches he worked or whatever. But again, I think just specifically that time was like a good time, and it made him really open to the experience with me and trying. And like to him, I just felt like it was his chance to make somebody, because he bragged about it every chance he could get after the match. But you always say how he made the masterpiece, which I had no problem with whatsoever. I was like, yep, you did.
Chris, I want to ask you about, Sean and I grew up, as many people watching this, grew up watching wrestling in the heydays. We talked about the Hogan and the Warrior, and then you get to the Attitude Era with D-Generation X, and then, WCW emerges on, and kind of from there. I think a lot of people can hold that near and dear to heart, where they would say, the Bret Hart era post, after Attitude, things, you look at attendance-wise, kind of fell off a little bit. And well, I want to ask you about the emergence of traditional style wrestling again, where, things maybe got a little more on the mic work and things like that. But what does dungeon wrestling mean to the art of wrestling when it comes to some of your mentors like Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart? And how exciting is it to be as part of that process and bringing wrestling back to its purest form?
Well, I love it because, I think Bret is very outspoken. But I think there's a lot of truth to what he says, you know what I mean? And it's like, and it goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, like everything is going to evolve. But like when it comes to the way Bret Hart and like a place like Dungeon Wrestling sees it, like it's always going to be based in realism too. Like you're never going to sacrifice the art just so you can do some kind of Circus LA high spot. You know what I mean? Like, so, that's kind of where I think it differs as far as mentality. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean it's stuck in any past time frame. Like it just means you have to make sense out of everything you do. Psychology is still emphasized. Strikes and stuff like that are just looked at as like connective tissue to the next high spot. And, and like, that's the whole idea. I mean, like, people kind of know what this is, professional wrestling. The whole idea in my mind, or the way I at least see it, is like, is to make everybody in the crowd believe. And that kind of really honestly just starts with the performer believing in what he's doing. So, I think that is kind of what, in my mind, dungeon wrestling and, at least like what Bret Hart emphasizes a lot. And, I don't differ, you know what I mean? I agree 100%. Well, Bret's just as unfiltered as anybody I've ever seen. But like, he's Bret Hart. Like, if anybody has kind of earned the right to do that, I think it's Bret. Like, and you kind of have to love that. And at this time, like, this is a time period, I think, where, and I've heard a lot of this, where authenticity is a big deal. Like, there's been so much overproduced kind of stuff, like when you look at The Rock, like he's turned heel, that like candor and not being overly scripted or overly cautious with your words, is kind of a welcoming side again. You know what I mean? And people aren't maybe as worried about getting canceled either as much anymore, I hope.
Now, you replied to a comment made by the voice of Dungeon Wrestling, Mike McGuire, on HNLive Today last week, where he spoke about your evolution as a performer and how much you had changed and grown since your time in WWE. And it's not that you weren't a great wrestler, a great athlete then, but your style's evolved, your approach has evolved. Can you speak about that a little bit? Because you seem to really connect with what he said about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I just really got to take that in today because I spent the weekend, my stomach was like, I lost like 12 pounds. Let's put it that way, as ill. But like today I'm finally recovering, and I saw that on the feed, and it was beautifully said. It's everything it's been the main focus of my life throughout the last few years, because I know that, I don't have, 20 years of working ahead of me, or, maybe even 10. Like, so like post-pandemic, the pandemic did a lot to me, but it really helped me kind of reevaluate how I was going to approach pro wrestling, along with having the platform of the National Wrestling Alliance. I don't want to overlook that. But it really just kind of helped me reapproach every facet of my game, whether it be the way I dress, the style I work, the way I conduct my promos, or the mentality I have going into them. And really, to sum it up, what it came down to is it was getting in touch with the fan in me, because I loved wrestling since I was a kid. I mean, this has been my main thing my whole life. You know, I had maybe 2 years of lapsed fandom, but it was getting in touch with my earliest fandom and then realizing and recognizing what he liked and just trying to focus everything on what he liked, you know, and making him a fan. And really it kind of helped simplify things. And like, you know, I just tried to make little tweaks to evolve. And the wrestling part's a huge one. But it wasn't just the wrestling. Like, obviously you stated in the wrestling, which I love, you know, as far as, you know, it's definitely much more, you know, technical, a lot more agility and movement. But I mean, that's what I loved in my performers growing up. I loved Mr. Perfect. I loved Ric Flair. I loved Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart. All those guys were able to cover that. They weren't so big that they had to be, you know what I mean, a 280-pound monster. They were more athletic guys that could move around the ring well and create more exciting matches. And so that was my focus on the in-ring stuff, was like, okay, I'm not going to be 280 pounds, nor do I want to be 280 pounds. I just fell into this thing where my body you know, my bodybuilding, everything came together where I just fell into that thing early in my career where I was a body guy. I didn't even anticipate that. I just, all of a sudden I was cast along with Luger and all those other guys. And I just made it work for me, but I don't think it was ever really the style of wrestler I wanted to be. I didn't want to be the overly huge guy that had to stagger on tackles and stuff. But that doesn't mean I want to be a skinny or small guy. I just wanted to be that more happy medium. Again, that Mr. Perfect kind of is a good archetype. You know, a guy who could still be big but athletic too. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need to be the biggest guy in the locker room or the tannest guy. I just want to be a good amount of those. And like, so again, like you guys were saying in the interview, it just, like, with that, it just led to my change in style. Like the fact that I was, you know, I geared my look towards that. It made me more athletic. And like, I started kind of recognizing like, oh, this is the performer I was really kind of always meant to be. But like, you know, I ended up kind of falling into that, like, you're going to be a body guy. And you know what I mean? And like, I was still athletic even in my young career. But, you know, again, like when WWE first introduced me, I was 20 years old. So, I mean, with the experience I have now, and, you know, it's just, there's just no comparison. You know what I mean? Like, to the guy I was then and now. And I've tried to honestly just separate. I've made the most conscious effort in the last couple of years, 2 to 3 years, to try to distance myself and evolve as much as possible to the point where, you know, hopefully I can almost be a different guy.
Well, I'm glad you said Mr. Perfect, because when I look at your shtick, I suppose for lack of a better term, and the character that you're portraying in some of the videos I've watched, I thought, like, there's a little Shawn Michaels there, there's a little Razor Ramon, there's a little bit of Kurt Hennig, which, in my opinion, may be the best wrestler ever to never win.
I love that you said Scott. But just real quick, I love that you said Scott, because I wouldn't even thought about that. But Scott, like, I feel like Scott is a guy I never give enough credit to, because he's a guy that I loved to imitate as a kid. I used to love to do his poses. So whether I even say it out loud or not, it's just like you said, the seeds of all these guys, a little bit of all these guys is planted in me, and like whether it's conscious or not. And the Scott Hall one is, you know, not even when I do consciously.
Now, looking at you in that sunshine in
Sorry for
California.
interrupting you, man.
No, it's you read my mind. I was just going to ask you about the inspiration side of it, because I mean, we all, you know, I think as kids we're like, I want to be this guy and that guy. And as a longtime wrestling fan, not as much lately, but I'm looking at him going, okay, there's Razor Ramon, there's Mr. Perfect, there's Shawn Michaels, there's a little bit of all that. So that's awesome. Great stuff. Go ahead, Sean.
Now, just looking at you sitting in the sunshine in California. Now, I know you mentioned it before we got on the air. Yeah, well, we are. But you mentioned before we got on the air that you had shoveled some cars out of snow in Toronto, living there for a couple of years. So we consider you an honorary Canadian, going up against a guy on Dungeon Wrestling, Unfinished Business 2, and Steve Macklin, who's got kind of that, you know, American angle to him a little bit, and a former TNA world champion. So just tell us about that matchup and what we can expect on March 29th on HNLive.ca.
I mean, I think it's going to be a physical affair. I mean, I've had like Steve Macklin, like I've done some homework on him, and I quite honestly, I'm going to have to do some more, because this guy just seems very physical, and I have just become aware of him. Like, I feel like he really started kind of making a name for himself within the last few years, and just has really built up this resume and become, you know, like just one of the top guys doing it today. So I think this is going to be a heck of a matchup. And when it was presented to me, I was all game, you know what I mean? Because they hit me up about this, and I'm like, yeah, that would definitely be a hell of a matchup and a physical contest, and something I think Brett would enjoy, and all the people, all the fans in Calgary and Dungeon Wrestling. And, you know, so March 29th is going to be, let's put it this way, I got that one circled on the calendar.
Well, that's awesome, Chris. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Great conversation with the masterpiece, Chris Masters, Chris Adonis, whatever you want to call him. He's the Stu Hart Heritage Champion for Dungeon Wrestling, and will face Steve Macklin on March 29th. And what a great conversation, Dave.
Very transparent guy. You know, I think anybody who grew up as a wrestling fan, which I think in our generation was pretty much everybody, right? So in being able to hear the stories of him as a kid, you know, and I wanted to get into wrestling, and then, you know, it wasn't really a body, you know, a big jacked guy. I just kind of got into it, the inspirations and some how those things go into a shtick. Those are all the things that you, as a wrestling observer, pre-social media era, with the opportunity to talk to some of these athletes, would think, he looks a lot like him. I wonder if that guy inspired him. So that, to me, was my biggest takeaway. I thought that was pretty cool.
It's Steve Macklin, the challenger for Chris Masters, coming up on March 29th on HNLive.ca.
Yeah, it's definitely something special. Being a kid growing up in Calgary, coming to the Saddle Dome all the time, season tickets for the Flames, watching the Hitmen all the time. Had a chance out here with the Hitmen when I was a kid, so it's a great experience being out here. My two worlds marrying each other, wrestling and hockey in one. Can't beat it, and the crowd is electric. It's got to be done again.
That's why you worked in the glass there, right? It was a little flashback to your hockey days?
Absolutely. I mean, getting my face right up against the glass, it felt nice. It reminded me of my hockey playing days.
But to actually be here in the Saddle Dome, where so much, especially Calgary wrestling history, has taken place, so much Hart family history, this is 14-year-old me just freaking out right now. Like, I'm having the absolute best time of my life.
We just saw Tom Billington here, and I could have sworn we were transported back in time.
Well, and the amazing thing, too, is that as fans were just piling into the building for that one, you saw the entire building start to migrate over towards the ring. You know, they're here for a hockey game between the Calgary Hitmen and the Red Deer Rebels, but there's something about seeing wrestling, especially when you got great wrestlers like the two we had starting off tonight. It gets your attention. It's definitely something that people want to see.
I mean, just look at it. What an iconic venue. It's been truly an honour to finally compete in the Saddle Dome, especially long before me, my relatives, Uncle Dynamite Kid and the British Bulldog, the tag team British Bulldogs in WWF. You know, I'm actually so fortunate to have the opportunity to just carry on my family's legacy and to actually forge my own legacy, and especially to have legendary professional wrestlers like Bret the Hitman Hart, who's Calgary's own. You know, he's a Canadian legend, and to have his guidance is something I couldn't trade anything for the world. To have such a privilege.
Once upon a time, I was just a kid sitting in the crowd watching Bret Hart, you know, get inducted, and now I get to perform in front of all the Calgarians, and it was really surreal.
Tell me about being a part of Dungeon Wrestling and why it's special to be a part of this great Calgary tradition, but the next generation.
For sure. I think there's so much history here in Calgary, and something that Dungeon really assures is that you are getting the best quality wrestling right here in the heart of Calgary.
Well, there was a lot of heat in there, and I'm going to wake up feeling it tomorrow. But at the end of the day, like, it's more so you do what you got to do. We were put in a match, and she was willing to do what it takes to win. She was a little bit rude to the kids. I had to overlook that, but it's also International Women's Day, so we got to kind of, you know, support one another.
And women's wrestling has come so far, hasn't it, to be a part of that?
Oh yeah, like I've heard so many tales regarding women's wrestling and how it's evolved. I've heard of people like going through those changes, and I'm glad to be in this era of professional wrestling. I think it's exceptional.
March 29th, Unfinished Business 2 at the Victoria Pavilion and on HNLive.ca. Tell me how excited you are about that card and why people should either get to the venue or order it on pay-per-view.
Well, I'll tell you right now, our main event stands on its own legs right now. You've got the masterpiece, Chris Masters, who, again, is our Stu Hart Heritage Heavyweight Champion. We talked about it before in past interviews, how this isn't the Chris Masters from the 2000 odds where he's just coming in, being a body guy. He's here to wrestle. He's here to defend that championship. He's been defending it around the world. The record on that title and the lineage has been growing. But the guy he's taking on is no slouch himself. A recent TNA World Heavyweight Champion, Steve Macklin. This guy is coming for gold, and he's coming with a mission. And you know what? He might have Chris Masters in his sights.
Well, with Tom Billington, they're going to see just something completely different. They're going to be seeing someone who's just willing to risk their life and body and just everything like they've ever had and leave it all in the ring and leave no stone unturned.
And you have Mike Clark coming up. What does he have in store for him in that matchup?
Well, Mike Clark, a very good professional wrestler, just talks too much. You got a bit of that ego going on with him, and all I've got to say is that Mike Clark is in for the fight of his life at the end of March.
I'm not looking past Chris Knight, but my eye is on the Stu Hart Heritage Championship, that I want to make sure they get that title. You got Chris Masters, Steve Macklin going at it. I just slapped the taste out of the mouth of Chris Knight, made him bleed his own blood, and I'll do it again on March 29th at the Pavilion. So you come check it out and watch me on that rise to the championship, because I want to represent this city better than anybody else ever has in the wrestling world, because I want to be the one that breaks that masterpiece. I want to be the one that bends that piece of steel. I want to be the one that takes that championship away and make the people of Calgary happy.
What? Yeah, I had him. Then some dog or some crap jumped up on the ring, and it sucks, man. So what do you think? Some dog grabs my chair when I'm about to win the match. It's not good. What do you think?
I can only imagine how you're feeling, but you only have a few weeks before you get your hands on Raj Singh again. So tell me about that matchup coming up. Unfinished business, March 29th.
When's that?
March 29th.
On the 29th, downtown here at the Stampede Grounds, I'm going to take Raj Singh and I'm going to break his neck. That's what I'm going to do.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck on the 29th.
I don't need it, mate. Do I?
No.
That's right.
Right.
Where's the smokes?
I'll ask somebody. Anyone have smokes? Another local guy made good, but in a different sport that has a different level but a similar physical intensity, is Mo Jabari of Dungeon Wrestling. And Dungeon Wrestling coming up on March 29th, Unfinished Business 2, live from the Victoria Pavilion in Calgary, and on pay-per-view, $11.99 on HNLive.ca. The headliner, Chris Masters against Steve Macklin for the Stu Hart Championship. But a great card full of talent from across the world, including some great local Calgary talent. Dungeon Wrestling Unfinished Business 2 coming up on March 29th from the Victoria Pavilion in Calgary and on HNLive.ca, joined by Mo Jabari. Mo, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Of course. My pleasure, man. I'd love to chat with you, and also love to talk about Dungeon Wrestling and the pay-per-view. It's all a good day's work.
First of all, just talk about how you came to start working with Dungeon Wrestling.
It's a long story short, pretty much, but I have a good relationship with Dallas, with Steve, with that whole family, with Brad, with the entire family, and it just came up because I think Dal has ran a show before, I think a couple years back, and one day we were just sitting around, and it just came up like, hey, what if we did it again, or what if you did it again, or like what would that look like? And Dal was like, sure, let's try it, and we tried it, and it was an instant success. And then from there, our goals got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it came to a point where we're like, Dal, let's do what your grandfather used to do. Let's go to the pavilion. Let's play with the big boys and try our luck, and we did. And as of right now, I think we can probably say we've done a great job in the city of Calgary.
Why do you think there's such a hunger for this style of wrestling, for what Stampede used to do, but on a modern basis?
That's a good question, especially with the style of wrestling. The thing is with just like any sport, just like anything in the world, everything evolves, really, right? Everything evolves, everything changes. But at the end of the day, the foundation of how it started, people always loved that. And Stampede Wrestling was fundamental wrestling, was one-on-one wrestling, was the best storytelling, it was the best stories you could see anywhere, especially they had the best wrestlers in the world. Wrestling was simple. It was understood by all. And that's what we try to bring it to the dungeon, what we try to bring to the pavilion again is simple wrestling, yet the best wrestling. We bring the best wrestlers around and we put them in the ring and we say, hey, go out there and make magic happen. And with that being said, we try to involve everybody in the city of Calgary, and I think Stu did a good job of doing that with Stampede Wrestling. Not only was he bringing and was he producing the best wrestlers in the world, but he also made sure the city of Calgary was showcased, and I think we've done that. I think if you've been to our shows, anyone that has come to our shows has seen, public figures of Calgary, have seen upcoming athletes of Calgary, different. We work with the Hitman, we work with, I think the mayor has come to our show, and it's like, when you come to Dungeon Wrestling, you see Calgary 101, and we love that, and I think we've done a good job of that, and I think the world, anyone who supports us all over the world sees it.
Well, yeah, you being close with the Hart family, I know you were just telling me that you get to work out with Bret Hart some, and just talk about the difference that he has made to your career and to you as a wrestler.
Well, I can't even begin to tell you. I think from the time I met Bret and the time Bret has taken me under his wing and kind of provided me the best education in the world, my game and my skills and my education, everything has changed for me. I have since wrestled everywhere you can possibly think of. I've wrestled WWE, AEW, NWA. I've wrestled all over Canada, all over the States. So like to say Bret hasn't changed anything for me would be the biggest lie I can tell. But I love Bret Hart. I love everything he stands for, and I love how much he loves wrestling. And if I can take a little bit of Bret Hart and put it, to my game, and fans can be like, hey, Mo Jabari reminds me of this thing that Bret did, and to me that would be the ultimate goal, and I appreciate him. And like I said, yeah, like after we get off this interview, I have to drive 35 minutes to 40 minutes to his house to get a workout in, and then to watch wrestling and just break it down. I'm very privileged and I'm very lucky to do that. I was literally all of yesterday. I went to his house yesterday to chat with him about some opportunities that's coming up for me, and to see what he thinks of it, and to get his opinion on it. And it was just supposed to be just an hour, or maybe who knows, maybe 20 minutes or whatever. And we finally looked at the clock, and it was like 5 hours later. We just sat down and talked about different things, and things that I should do going forward, etc. So I love Bret Hart, and I love everything he teaches me, and everything that he tries to install in me, and I wish one day I can do that for someone else.
What do you think are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned from him throughout that process?
Being a nice person for sure, and that's something that's lost in the wrestling world, especially and that's just not the wrestling world, that's just anywhere. But the minute you become a name of some sort, if some fame comes, people kind of change, and sure, and that's okay, and that's understandable. I think Bret's one person that's known for being the absolute best human you can possibly think of. He takes the time to deal with his fans, to talk to them. You go to a Bret Hart autograph session, it ends maybe 3-4 hours after it's supposed to end, because he takes the time, hears the stories. And he often used to tell me, these are the people that fed his family. These are the people that raised his kids with him. So to take that lesson, and for me to walk around, and anytime anyone says, hey, Mo, you're my favorite wrestler, or hey, I'm a fan of yours, I take the time to talk to them and make sure they have an experience, and they can go and say, hey, Mo Jabari is my friend, really.
What are some for you? You've mentioned the new opportunities you've had. You've been able to wrestle in all sorts of different promotions. What are some of the highlights of your career? I mean, Dungeon certainly would be one of them, but what are some highlights that stand out for you in your career so far?
Oh man, there's a lot. Of course, I would be lying if I didn't say like wrestling on Monday Night Raw wasn't one of them. I was very lucky, especially to do it in Alberta, in Edmonton of all places, where I have wrestled God knows how many times, and have wrestled in front of 5 people. I've wrestled in front of 10 people. I've wrestled in front of 100. The number goes up, but to wrestle in front of like 15,000 people in Edmonton, and not only to wrestle there, but to have a lot of families, a lot of family friends, a lot of friends, a lot of fans, to walk to the ring and to hear people call my name and, chant for me was surreal to me. And it was a moment that I won't forget for a very long time. And hopefully a moment that I can live many times over.
Coming up on Unfinished Business 2 on March 29th, you've got a matchup with Harlan Abbott. Just tell me about that match and what we can expect from it as fans.
I'm looking forward to wrestling Harlan Abbott, and he's a stable here in Calgary, in Alberta. He's a guy that has wrestled all over Canada and all over Alberta for many years. I think he's up there in the 15-year mark type of thingy, and that's a guy you don't want to mess with when you're in deep waters like that. When he's wrestled that many years and has that many experience, and I don't have as much experience as he does. So for me, it would have to be, to come in, to be smart, to be direct, and to get to the point right away. And that's to win right away. I can't fool around. I can't let him get in his groove. And for me, it's just get in and get out is my goal. Get in and get out. And you can expect the best match, quite possibly the best match of the night. I believe that's a match that can sell out anywhere in the world. He's a great talent, and I've wrestled him before. Not at this capacity, but I've wrestled him in a smaller venue, and I've had great matches with him. But he is a guy you can't play around with. He is a guy that also likes to come in and get the job done right away. So for me not to take him serious would be a problem that I have to deal with later on.
Now, at the same time, as much as you're focused on the match you're having with your connections to the Hart family, how much are you watching that Stu Hart Heritage Championship match between Chris Masters and Steve Macklin and getting your eye towards that title?
Absolutely. That's actually a good question. And that's a belt, and that's Stu Hart. We all know who Stu Hart is, and we all know what he stands for, not only here, but in the wrestling business in general. That's a guy that is respected all over the world. And that belt, Chris Masters says it all the time. It's a belt that he cherishes, and he walks around everywhere in the world proudly wearing it. I'd be lying to say it wouldn't be a goal, it wouldn't be a dream to not win that belt in that arena. I'm a big Hart guy. I'm a big, historian of the profession, and for me, if I can do that in that building, it would be surreal. And of course, I'd be watching it really close, and I'd be cheering. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't cheering for Masters. But it would also be a problem to deal with. So we'll see what happens on the 29th, I guess.
I guess just, lastly, if you're giving the sales pitch to fans out there, whether they're going to attend in person at the Victoria Pavilion, or if they're unable to get there and they're going to watch on HNLive.ca, what is it about Dungeon Wrestling Unfinished Business 2? Why should they go out of their way to see it?
It's the best wrestling money can buy, really. First of all, you get a card that you wouldn't see anywhere. You got a main event that can main event a pay-per-view anywhere, any company in the world. That goes for WWE, that goes for AEW, that goes for Impact, that goes for everywhere. That main event alone is worth the ticket price and is worth the pay-per-view buys. But then again, you have an undercard with guys like myself, guys like Raj Singh, guys like Rohan Raju. You got Chris Knight. You got top of the top-notch athletes and wrestlers. But like I said, our wrestling shows aren't just wrestling. It's an event. It's an event that you never know what's going to be there. You never know what's going to happen. You never know who's going to show up. You'll see, not only will you enjoy the wrestling, but you'll enjoy watching the fans enjoy the wrestling. That's the one thing about Dungeon Wrestling. If you don't like a match, you look around, it's like you see kids jumping, you see kids running all over the place, you see grown adults throwing their drinks, going crazy. It's like I feel like once you walk through the doors of the pavilion, age doesn't matter anymore. Age doesn't matter anymore. Who you are doesn't matter anymore. It's a fun time. It's a great time, and we often get messages like immediately saying, "I cannot wait for the next show. I cannot wait." It's crazy to think about this, but we'll get messages where people will be like, "Hey, tonight I watched Dungeon Wrestling in the same seats that I used to watch with my dad." Stampede Wrestling, I watched Bret Hart versus Dynamite Kid in those same seats that I just watched with my grandson or with you or something. It's crazy to think that. It's not only about the wrestling; it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that, and I think that's one thing that Calgary wrestling and the Stampede territory is all about. It's nostalgia, it's memory, it brings families together. And that's what Dungeon Wrestling is about. It's not just about the wrestling. It's about everybody. It's about the families. It's about the friends. It's about the memories. And like I said, once you see the people having fun, it's hard not to have fun.
That's awesome, Mo. Thank you so much for taking the time, and good luck on the 29th.
Absolutely. I can't wait.
Again, it's going to be Dungeon Wrestling Unfinished Business, Mo Jabari and company in action, March 29th from the Victoria Pavilion in Calgary, and of course, streaming on HNLive.ca.